Hello and welcome. Tonight we invite you on a quiet journey back through the mists of time. Make yourself comfortable as we drift gently to a distant era, to the 6th century, where an empire stands at its height, yet on the brink of an unseen calamity. This will be a calm and reflective exploration of a nearly forgotten chapter of history, the story of the Justinianic Plague of 541, a pandemic long ago that quietly shaped the medieval world to come. Settle in, let the soft glow of imagination guide you, and let us begin our gentle voyage into the past. Imagine the Eastern Roman Empire in the mid-500s of our common era, a realm of marble cities and ancient traditions. Often called Byzantium by modern historians, it is in truth the living continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. Its capital, Constantinople, sits like a jewel between Europe and Asia, and monoculture with consequential pathos like that of a jewel between Europe and Asia. In this age, Emperor Justinian I rules from his great palace in Constantinople, striving to restore the old glory of Rome. Under his steady hand, the empire has reconquered lands that were lost, North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Goths, and his armies stand guard from the sun-baked deserts of Syria to the forests of the Danube frontier. Justinian is a tireless ruler, known for his ambition and energy. He codified Roman law into a monumental code, built splendid monuments, and dreams of reuniting the entire Mediterranean world under Roman dominion once more. In the year 540, it seems those dreams are within reach. Much of the western territories have been reclaimed, and Constantinople is at the center of a realm that spans thousands of miles. Constantinople in those days is a bustling metropolis of perhaps 500,000 souls. The city awakens each morning to the sound of church bells and the cries of street vendors echoing off stone walls. Merchants from distant lands carry wares through its forums. Silks from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, wine and olive oil from Syria and Greece. The great domed cathedral of Hagia Sophia, only recently completed by Justinian's order, rises majestically above the city's skyline. Its newly gilded mosaics catch the morning light, a symbol of divine glory in an empire of Christian faith. Nearby, the ancient hippodrome echoes with the cheers of chariot races on festival days, the crowds roaring as their favored teams of horses thunder around the track. In the narrow, winding streets, artisans open their shops, bakers stoke their ovens to bake the day's bread, and children laugh and play in the courtyards. The harbour, known as the Golden Horn, is forested with the masts of ships that have come from Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and even farther. This city is the beating heart of the empire, rich, vibrant, and seemingly invincible. The people of Constantinople live their lives in a routine that feels timeless. Many are deeply devout, visiting one of the dozens of churches each day to light candles and whisper prayers. Others are caught up in lively commerce that flows through the market. Scholars in the city's schools discuss philosophy and law. Senators and officials bustle in the halls of the imperial palace, debating policies and taxes. There is an air of confidence. Justinian's reign has been marked by success and renewal. The empire's treasury, though strained by wars and building projects, still pours forth gold to maintain the frontiers and adorn the capital with splendor. Far across the city, one can smell the spices from the Egyptian bazaar or hear the steady hammer of a blacksmith in the distance. Life hums along with all the ordinary joys and sorrows, births and deaths that mark the passage of time in any great city. In one such bustling district, a cloth merchant named Andreas begins his day like any other. He unbars the shutters of his shop overlooking a busy street, where he sells fine woven fabrics and dyed woolens. His wife Helena and their 2 young children help with small tasks, the children giggling as they chase each other between bolts of cloth, and Helena keeping the household running upstairs. Andreas greets his neighbors cheerfully every morning. The baker next door, who brings fresh bread, the fishmonger across the way setting up his stall. The rhythm of work and family life gives Andreas comfort. In the afternoons, when business slows, he often strolls to the public fountain to catch up on gossip or share a cup of watered wine with his friend Tomas, the fishmonger. Their talk is of common things: the price of dye, the antics of their children, a small repair needed on the shop roof. In the evenings, Andreas closes the shop and joins his family for supper by lamplight. They say their prayers and sleep peacefully. never imagining that anything could soon shatter the warmth of their simple daily routine. On his throne in the great palace overlooking the Hippodrome sits Emperor Justinian himself, the man who has steered this empire to its current height. He is now in his 50s, vigorous and deeply involved in all affairs of state. Each morning, Justinian meets with his council, poring over documents, issuing orders to generals and governors across his vast domain. He is a tireless worker. Contemporaries say he sleeps only a few hours a night, spending the rest of his time legislating or planning campaigns. To the people of Constantinople, Justinian is a distant but almost legendary figure. They have seen him occasionally during grand processions, a solemn, dignified man with a clean-shaven face and a crown upon his head, riding in a gilded chariot during religious festivals. Many credit him with the security they feel. After all, it was his armies that brought Italy and Africa back into the Roman fold, and his architects that built the splendid Hagia Sophia that graces their skyline. In the popular imagination, Justinian is almost a figure of destiny, chosen to restore the glory of Rome. He and his clever Empress Theodora, who is equally renowned for her intelligence and courage, represent stability and hope. Under their rule, it seems the empire can overcome any challenge. Beyond the city walls, the empire's provinces are humming with activity as well. The roads leading into Constantinople carry a constant traffic of carts and travelers. Peasant farmers from nearby Thracian villages bring their produce to the city markets. Cartloads of wheat, barrels of olive oil, flocks of sheep and goats for sale. These country folk enter through the great gates and the Theodosian walls, marveling at the size of the capital each time. In their hamlets, life is simpler. They tend vineyards and grain fields that have fed the city for generations. Monasteries dot the countryside, where monks tend gardens and pray for the empire's well-being. In the smaller towns of Asia Minor, Syria and Greece, local markets trade goods under the warm sun, and children play in dusty courtyards just as they do in Constantinople. Even lands far to the west, in Italy and Spain, which have recently been reclaimed by Justinian's generals, are experiencing a moment of relative calm under imperial rule. It is a time of order and optimism. To most, it feels like a blessed era, a new Pax Romana, perhaps, in which prosperity has returned. Few suspect that this tranquility is fragile, about to be tested by an unprecedented calamity quietly creeping in from the edges of their world. Yet, even in these seemingly prosperous times, there have been unsettling omens. A few years earlier, the sky itself gave a sign that all was not well. In the year 536, an eerie darkness fell across many lands. The sun's light dimmed mysteriously, failing to warm the earth as it normally did. Summer days felt like twilight. A chill hung in the air, even at noon. Crops withered in the fields due to unseasonable frosts, and a veil of dust in the atmosphere. People whispered that perhaps the sun was faltering, or that some curse lay upon the world. Across the empire, harvests were meagre that year and the next, leading to hardship in some regions. There were reports of hunger and displacement, villagers leaving their homes in search of food, wandering to towns that might have grain. These strange climatic events were poorly understood, but the people endured them as they had weathered many trials with prayers and hope for better seasons. Indeed, modern historians and scientists suspect that this climate disaster and resulting famine weakened the population's health, making people less resistant to disease. Malnutrition and hunger in the late 530s meant that by the early 540s, many people's bodies were vulnerable. A minor illness might fell someone who would otherwise have been strong. Thus, the strange weather may have unwittingly prepared the ground for the plague's grim harvest, a cruel synergy of nature's calamities. Though the people of the time could not know this chain of cause and effect, they keenly felt that one misfortune was following on the heels of another. No one could know that this climatic downturn, the dusty skies and failed crops, was but a prelude, weakening communities and setting the stage for something far more devastating to come. We now drift to the year 541, nearly 14 years into Justinian's reign. The empire is engaged in battles at its frontiers. Justinian's generals fight fierce wars in Italy against the last Ostrogothic defenders, and to the east, an uneasy truce holds with the Persian Empire after rounds of conflict. Trade and travel continue despite these conflicts, binding together a vast realm. Caravans move along the old Roman roads and ships cross the Mediterranean sea lanes. Grain ships in particular are the lifeline of Constantinople. The capital's enormous population depends on regular grain deliveries, especially from Egypt's fertile Nile Valley. Every year, fleets of large ships laden with Egyptian wheat cross the city to feed the city. These ships tie the capital intimately to the ports of Egypt and Syria. It is in one of those distant, bustling ports that quiet rumblings of trouble begin. On the southern shore of the Mediterranean lies the province of Egypt, ancient land of the pharaohs and now a crucial part of Justinian's empire. In the northeast corner of Egypt, at the mouth of the Nile Delta, sits the trading port of Pelusium. Pelusium is a busy gateway where river barges bring goods down the Nile to be loaded onto sea vessels bound for Constantinople and other cities. In the late months of 540 or early 541, perhaps, some of the locals in Pelusium notice a strange illness afflicting people in their town. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. A fever here, a sudden death there. Some people develop swellings in their groin or under their arms, painful lumps that appear out of nowhere. The illness causes high fevers, chills, and delirium. At first, it is just a few isolated cases among the crowded neighborhoods near the docks and grain warehouses. There is no reason yet for alarm beyond the local community. Sickness is not unknown in these times, and people often fall ill with fevers of various sorts. But this sickness is different. It spreads swiftly from house to house, and those who catch it often die within days. From Pelusium, the malady fans out along the trade routes. The merchants and sailors who had been in Pelusium carry the disease unknowingly to the next great city, Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt. Alexandria, with its grand lighthouse and storied libraries, second only to Constantinople in the Eastern Empire, is soon stricken. By the latter part of 541, reports of a terrible plague in Alexandria reach the ears of officials and merchants abroad. People are dying in great numbers there, with the same terrifying symptoms of high fever and swollen, sometimes blackened lymph nodes, the painful bubbos in the groin or armpit. Panic begins to take hold in parts of Egypt as the disease moves along the Nile. From the delta, it travels upriver, infecting villages and towns along its banks. It also spreads eastward, following the roads and sea lanes into Palestine and Syria. By early 542, the plague is raging in port cities like Caesarea and Accra in the Levant, and creeping along the caravan trails toward Antioch. For now, Constantinople has only heard faint murmurs of distant sickness, a rumor that in far-off Egypt a pestilence has broken out. Such news is worrying, but not uncommon. Local outbreaks of disease have happened before in history. Perhaps some in Constantinople offer a little prayer for their brethren far away, but life in the capital continues normally, blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. Trade being the artery of the empire, it is impossible to fully quarantine regions. By the spring of 542, ships from the infected ports are still arriving in Constantinople, as they always do, bringing grain and goods and something else unseen. Aboard those ships, in the dark holds filled with sacks of wheat, reside black rats that scamper in the shadows. These rats carry within their blood a deadly bacterium, and their fleas, in search of fresh hosts, are the tiny agents of that bacterium's spread. Unknowingly, the empire's own networks of commerce are ferrying death into its heart. One can imagine a day like any other in the docks of Constantinople. Stevedores unloading cargoes of wheat, merchants haggling over spices and textiles, sailors disembarking to visit the taverns and bathhouses of the city after a long voyage. Among the cargo that one particular ship carries are a few stowaways, disease-infested fleas that leap from the fur of dead or dying rats and find new homes on the city's ubiquitous rodents, on stray cats and dogs, or even on the clothes of people handling the freight. A few observant souls might have noticed an ominous sign before the sickness in humans became obvious. In the days leading up to the outbreak, city cats and dogs was seen nosing at the carcasses of an unusually large number of dead rats in alleyways and granaries. At the time, people did not know what to make of it. Perhaps it was chalked up to some pest poison or a lingering effect of the strange weather. Only later would they remember with a shudder that the rats had died off just before the plague struck the people. At first, no one notices the insidious spread of these unseen killers. The late spring weather in Constantinople is mild, and the city is as lively as ever, but within a few weeks, the first cases of an unusual illness appear in the capital. In Andreas's neighborhood, the first alarm comes when his friend Thomas, the fishmonger, fails to open his stall one morning. Word spreads that Thomas is gravely ill at home with a fever and a grotesque swelling in his groin. Andreas, concerned, peeks in from the doorway and sees his neighbor lying delirious and ashen, attended by his distraught wife. By the next day, the fishmonger's entire household is stricken. The street grows hushed with dread as neighbors realize the sicknesses in their midst. Physicians are called to examine some of these patients suffering from mysterious symptoms. Most of these doctors have been trained in the classical tradition of medicine, following the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. They believe that illness may be due to imbalances of bodily humors, or perhaps miasmas, corrupted air, that brings disease. They attempt remedies within that framework. Perhaps they administer herbal potions to reduce fever, or suggest bloodletting to balance the humours. Some resort to burning aromatic herbs or incense, hoping to cleanse the bad air. Many people cling to folk remedies or spiritual talismans. Some tie sachets of camphor and lavender around their necks to ward off the bad air, while others pin religious icons or charms to their clothing for divine protection. Small shrines spring up on street corners, where candles are lit day and night before images of saints. Parents gently place amulets under the pillows of their sick children, whispering prayers to the Archangel Michael or the Virgin Mary to intercede. Physicians try one treatment after another. Special teas of mint or rose, poultices of onion and fig applied to the swellings, even lancing the buboes in a desperate attempt to drain the ill humours. But despite their efforts, the patients continue to worsen and die. This illness does not respond to the usual treatments. Day by day, the number of the sick grows. What began with a handful of people becomes dozens, and then hundreds. The disease spreads like an invisible fog through the city's neighborhoods. It does not confine itself to any one class or group. In fine mansions and villas, nobles and wealthy merchants fall ill just as readily as laborers in the streets. In the crowded tenements where the poor live shoulder to shoulder, whole families take sick at once. In monasteries, monks collapse in their cloisters. In marketplaces, vendors lie feverish on their mats. The plague creeps through every quarter, from the port districts by the Sea of Marmara up to the bustling forums and even into the gated imperial palace complex itself. As the contagion spreads, fear and confusion spread with it. At first, there might have been attempts to isolate those who were sick. Perhaps when a member of a household showed early signs of the illness, their family in desperation would shut them inside a single room or send them to a relative outside the city, hoping to prevent the spread under their roof. But these efforts are largely in vain. The disease has already seeded itself throughout the urban fabric. In homes across the city, scenes of heartbreak unfold. Families huddle together in prayer around a stricken loved one, watching over them by the flicker of oil lamps through the night. In some households, entire families are sick at the same time, with no one healthy enough to care for the others. Neighbors who in better times would come to assist are now terrified to cross the threshold. For Andreas, the plague's cruelty strikes home with devastating clarity. His beloved wife Helena is one of those who fall ill early during the onslaught. She develops a high fever and a tender lump in her armpit. Andreas does everything he can. He brings water to cool her brow, offers her broth, and refuses to leave her side, even as friends beg him to flee the infected house. Their children watch in fear from the next room. After several agonizing days, Helena passes away, her frail hand in Andreas's, as he whispers a final prayer through tears. He barely has a chance to mourn before their youngest child, a little daughter of 4 years, also becomes feverish. With a breaking heart, Andreas cares for his child around the clock. By what he will later call a miracle, the little girl survives, though she is left weak and the family forever scarred by the experience. Still, half of Andreas's household is gone. The empty chair at the table and the silence where his wife's gentle voice once resounded will haunt him in the days to come. Fear hangs thick in the air, as palpable as the foul odour of sickness that now wafts through many streets. Many people shut themselves inside their homes, hoping to avoid contact with others and with the poisoned air that is believed to carry the disease. It is not uncommon for those who have the means to flee. Some families pack their belongings into carts or small boats and leave the city altogether, escaping to country estates or smaller towns, praying that distance might spare them. One such family, a wealthy merchant and his kin, hastily boards a ship to sail to a secluded island villa they own in the Sea of Marmara. As the vessel pulls away from the docks of Constantinople, they look back at the silhouette of the city, its great dome and towers still serene under the sun, not knowing if they will have a home or friends to return to. On the island they wait anxiously for weeks, fishing for food and praying daily for the plague to pass. They hear no news, only silence from the mainland. And eventually, when they dare to return, they find their neighborhood greatly changed. Many of their neighbors' homes are shuttered or occupied by new faces, and the families among the fortunate few to come back whole. The servants they left behind in the city have mostly perished. This family's survival by flight becomes a tale whispered among those who later debate how best to respond in plague times, whether it's wiser to flee or to stay. Inside the city, those who cannot leave do what they can to survive. In many homes, doors and windows stay bolted. People venture out only if absolutely necessary to fetch water or bread if any can be found. The lively public gatherings of only weeks before vanish. The theatres and baths are empty. The great church of Hagia Sophia is not completely deserted. Some desperate faithful still come, keeping distance from one another, to light candles and weep before the icon of the Virgin, imploring protection, but the usual throngs are gone. The Patriarch of Constantinople and his clergy organize prayer vigils and processions, petitioning for divine mercy to lift the plague. One can picture a small procession of priests and monks clad in black robes, walking through a nearly deserted street, holding aloft crosses and holy relics, chanting hymns that echo against the closed shop fronts. The incense they carry wafts through the air in curling smoke, meant to purify the miasma. Now and then the little procession stops outside a home where people lie dying inside, and the priests sing a trisagion. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us for the souls departing. These ceremonies bring comfort to some, but others remain behind locked doors, too frightened to gather even for prayer. Across the city, death is touching every social circle. Each morning, when the bells of neighborhood churches toll, they seem to ring for the dead rather than for matins. Soon the normal rhythms of daily life grind to a halt. Markets remain closed. The public squares that once bustled with costermongers and customers become eerily quiet. The narrow lanes that were filled with the cries of children and the calls of street vendors fall silent. Instead, new sounds dominate. The creaking wheels of wagons laden with corpses, rolling through the streets to common pits outside the walls. Those carts become a common sight as the number of dead grows too large for the usual funerary customs. Many families, either out of fear or sheer inability, cease holding proper funerals. Undertakers, if they still answer their doors, charge exorbitant fees to carry bodies away, and soon even they are overwhelmed or struck down themselves. As the weeks pass and spring turns to early summer of 542, the plague in Constantinople reaches a horrifying crescendo. The city that once brimmed with life falls under the shadow of death. At the height of the outbreak, the death toll defies belief. Later chronicles claim that at its worst, as many as 10,000 people died each day in the city. Even if that figure is exaggerated by shocked witnesses, it conveys the scale of the calamity. Certainly, several thousand per day are perishing during the worst weeks. The city's grave diggers and undertakers are utterly overwhelmed. Tombs and small church graveyards fill rapidly, far beyond capacity. At first, families try to bury their loved ones individually, following the proper rites of Christian burial with prayers and incense, but soon there is neither room nor time for that. Emperor Justinian, himself now bedridden with the plague, issues urgent orders to address the crisis of the dead. Troops and any able-bodied men available are conscripted to collect and dispose of corpses, as the usual services have broken down. Under imperial direction, workers dig large pits and trenches outside the city walls to serve as mass graves. Into these trenches, soldiers and volunteers lower body after body, layer upon layer, trying their best to cover each layer with a thin coat of earth or lime before the next arrives. These mass burials are a horrifying necessity. Never in living memory has Constantinople seen its people disposed of in such a way, without individual ceremony, commingled in the earth by the hundreds. And yet even these vast pits cannot keep pace with the dying. When the burial trenches overflow and there is no space left to dig new ones quickly, more extreme measures are taken. In some of the city's empty towers, part of the ancient fortification walls, a solution is found. These stone towers become grim charnel houses. Workers carry corpses up the walls and stack them inside the stout towers. When the base of each tower is filled to bursting, they seal the entrances to hasten decomposition and reduce the stench. Quicklime is poured over the bodies before the doors are shut. Elsewhere, bodies are taken to the harbour. When land burial fails, the authorities resort to loading corpses onto old barges and boats. Dozens of bodies are piled on these derelict vessels, which are then towed out into the Sea of Marmara, set alight, and cast adrift as floating funeral pyres. From the city's shores, one can sometimes see the glow of these burning death ships at night, a sight both eerie and sorrowful, a final farewell offered far from shore for those who could not receive proper rites on land. Through all of this, the living move in a state of shock and grief. Many people avoid any contact with others, even the deceased bodies of their loved ones. Out of terror, some households simply carry their dead to the doorstep and leave them for the collectors, not daring to accompany them to burial. Fear has dissolved many of the normal bonds of society. Still, amid the chaos, acts of compassion and selflessness shine through the darkness. A number of individuals, overcoming their fear, devote themselves to caring for the sick and dying. Priests and monks go about plague-ridden neighborhoods, offering prayers and comfort to the afflicted and performing last rites for the dying in haste. Physicians, though nearly powerless to cure the disease, still make their rounds to alleviate suffering, applying cool compresses to burning foreheads or gently encouraging delirious patients. Neighbors, in some fortunate instances, take in orphan children after their parents succumb, or leave food at the doors of households too ill to fetch it. Many of these caregivers pay the ultimate price for their mercy, falling ill themselves after tending to others. And yet, in those bleak days, such kindness is a beacon of humanity. At the same time, there are those so overcome by terror that they can do nothing but look after their own survival. Some refuse to visit even their closest friends or relatives once sickness strikes, fearing the slightest contact. It is said that in certain desperate cases, when a member of a household shows symptoms, the rest of the family fled their own home entirely, abandoning the ill one in horror. The normal social order frays under the strain. People avoid the embrace of a neighbor. They cross to the other side of the street if they see someone coughing. They shy away from any gathering. And when someone dies, often their body might lie unattended for hours until the death cart comes, simply because no one nearby has the heart or nerve to go near. The city's economy and administration, too, grind to a halt. Markets are empty, shops remain shuttered, the courts and public offices cease functioning, magistrates and scribes are ill or dying, and there is no one to hear cases or record edicts. The wheels of empire pause, stuck in the thick mud of the plague. Justinian himself lies feverish in his silk-draped imperial bedchamber, attended by anxious courtiers and the royal physicians. The emperor, the energetic lawgiver and conqueror, is now pale and weak, a swelling in his groin marking where the infection has struck him. For days that stretch into weeks, he hovers between life and death. The empire holds its breath collectively. Rumors swirl that Justinian has died, then that he has miraculously recovered, then that he is on the brink again. In truth, his condition is dire, and prayers for his survival are said in every church of the capital. Empress Theodora, his stalwart partner, marshals what authority she can to keep the government running in these uncertain days. But she too is fearful that if Justinian dies, chaos will engulf the empire's leadership. Amazingly, almost inexplicably to those around him, Justinian survives. Whether by fortune, strong constitution, or divine grace, the emperor's fever eventually breaks. He slowly regains strength, defying the awful odds of this disease. Most who contract the plague die, but Justinian lives to continue his reign. His recovery is hailed as nearly miraculous by his subjects and courtiers. However, when he finally rises from his sickbed, he emerges into a drastically altered world. Many of his trusted advisors and generals are dead. The streets outside the palace are still and mournful. The grand ambitions that occupied Justinian's mind before his illness are suddenly weighed down by the immediate needs of a shattered capital. By the late summer of 542, roughly 4 months after the first cases, the plague in Constantinople begins to abate. The disease, having burned through so much of the population, can no longer find new hosts easily. Where at the peak thousands died each day, now the numbers dwindled to hundreds, then to dozens. Day by day, the reports of new fevers and deaths become less frequent. The worst appears to be over. A city that had been holding its breath in terror can at last exhale, though that breath is ragged with grief and exhaustion. The scenes that remain in the aftermath are haunting. Entire districts of the city have lost a huge portion of their inhabitants. In some neighborhoods, it is said, there is hardly a house without a death. Streets once loud with commerce and chatter are now somber and hushed. The forums, which had bustled with crowds in the spring, are half empty by autumn. Many shops do not reopen because their owners have died or because there are no customers with means to buy. Constantinople's population has been shorn by perhaps a third or more in a matter of months. Some accounts claim that nearly half of the city's people perished in this outbreak. The true number will never be known, but what is clear is that the metropolis is profoundly diminished. Survivors emerge from their homes like ghosts blinking in the sunlight, each carrying their own tale of sorrow. There are widows who have lost husbands, children who have lost parents, entire family lines wiped out, save for one trembling member. These survivors look around and see a city of emptiness where once there was vibrancy. Weeds grow in the courtyards of houses that now stand vacant, their occupants gone. The fountains in the public squares still flow, but fewer people pause to drink from them. The tether of normalcy is being severed, and those who remain wander through a landscape of grief. Yet, slowly, life must continue for the living. The ties of community, though strained, are not completely broken. Neighbors reach out to help one another rebuild their lives. Those who have lost everything are taken in by those fortunate enough to have been spared. Orphans are looked after by relatives or kindly strangers. Small communal efforts arise to feed and clothe children who have no one. The church plays a crucial role in succoring the destitute. Monasteries and charities in the city open their granaries, what little they have, to distribute food to survivors, especially to the poor, now struggling even more with so many breadwinners gone. For Andreas, life after the plague is forever changed. With Helena gone and only his young daughter surviving, his home feels unbearably empty in the evenings. Still, he forces himself to carry on for the sake of his child. Each morning he returns to his little shop in the market. The familiar faces of many customers and fellow merchants are missing, and some days no one comes to buy at all. Even so, Andreas dutifully opens his stall and lays out his fabrics, determined to keep a semblance of normalcy. Sometimes he finds himself gazing down the street, half expecting to see his friend Thomas the fishmonger cheerfully waving, but Thomas's stall remains closed and silent. When sorrow overwhelms him, Andreas murmurs a quiet prayer and reminds himself that he is not alone. Many around him share the same grief. In time, he befriends newcomers who arrive to take up the work of those lost. He even teaches a younger cousin the skills of the weaving trade to help rebuild his business. And in the evenings, he holds his little daughter close, grateful that she survived and that together they can remember Helena's love. These small acts, opening a shop, mending a garment, cooking a simple meal, become for Andreas acts of healing and defiance against despair. With each passing week, he notices a few more people in the streets, a few more stalls opening in the market, and he takes solace in these signs that the city is slowly coming back to life around him. Walking through Constantinople in those first months after the plague, one would see a mixture of lingering sadness and tentative renewal. Funeral processions still occur daily as families who had buried loved ones in haste now strive to give them proper memorials, or as those who clung to life through the worst finally succumb to lingering illness. The smell of incense from these rites drifts through the air of the city alongside the salt breeze from the sea. At the same time, one might also see builders repairing a roof on a house that had been left untended, or fishermen returning to cast their nets in the Bosporus, or a carpenter reopening his workshop to make coffins or furniture, whatever work is now needed. Children, those who survived, play quietly in an alleyway as their guardians keep watch with anxious eyes. Life is reasserting itself, gingerly and resolutely, amid the ruins. Constantinople has survived the Great Plague, but it is forever changed. Those who live through it will carry the memory of that year, its nightmares and lessons, for the rest of their days. Many will tell the next generation somber stories of the time when death came to the city and how they endured. And while the capital slowly regains some of its vitality, the wider empire is still in the throes of the pandemic. Even as Constantinople tends its wounds, reports arrive that the sickness is spreading to other lands, carving a path of misery far beyond the imperial city. Indeed, the plague does not vanish after that first cataclysmic wave. It becomes a relentless traveller, moving along the arteries of empire to nearly every corner of the known world. Even as Constantinople buries its dead and recovers its breath, the pandemic radiates outward into the provinces and beyond, carried by the movements of armies, merchants, and pilgrims along roads and sea lanes. In the eastern provinces, the pestilence that coursed through Syria and Palestine continues its deadly work. Antioch, one of the great cities of the East, falls victim not long after Constantinople. Farther east, the empire's great rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire, is not spared. By late 542 and 543, the plague has crossed beyond Roman borders. Earlier, even as the sickness raged in the Byzantine capital, it had already spread into Persian-held Mesopotamia. There are accounts that a Persian army which had been preparing to invade Roman territory in the Caucasus suddenly found itself stricken. King Khusro-Aishez of Persia, upon hearing that his soldiers were collapsing with the same dreaded disease that afflicted his enemy, is said to have halted his campaign. Facing this unseen scourge, the war for a time mattered less. The Persian forces retreated, carrying the pestilence with them into the Persian heartland. Soon, plague took hold in Persian cities and villages along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. In the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, communities that had little direct contact with Constantinople began to experience the same horror: sudden fevers, swellings, and a trail of death. Zoroastrian priests in the fire temples of Persia struggled to explain this catastrophe to their faithful. They saw it as an onslaught of evil spirits, or perhaps a trial sent by Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. In response, they performed purification rituals, the sacred fires were kept burning with special care, and priests chanted prayers to drive out the darkness of pestilence. It is said that in some places they led processions carrying holy flame through stricken neighborhoods to sanctify the air. Persian religious leaders, the Magi, did all they could, sprinkling holy water and reciting their Avestan mantras, hoping to dispel the druge of plague. They even temporarily altered their funerary customs, whereas normally Zoroastrians exposed their dead in towers of silence for vultures to consume, believing burial or burning would pollute the sacred elements of earth or fire. Now, with corpses abundant and contagion feared, they had to bury some bodies or treat them with chemicals to limit the spread. Despite all efforts, the plague ran its course. Among Persians, as cruelly as it did among. Within a year, both great empires, Byzantine and Persian, are reeling from the blow of this invisible enemy. To the west of Constantinople, the plague marches into the heart of Europe. Justinian's wars had been raging in Italy for years, weakening that peninsula's population and economy. Now, as the plague arrives, it compounds the misery. In 543, the year after the plague devastated Constantinople, Italy is in turmoil. The Byzantine forces and the Ostrogothic defenders have been slogging through a brutal war. When plague appears in Italy, it strikes an already wounded land. Historians note that as the disease moved through the Italian countryside, it affected both the occupying Byzantine troops and the local Italian population alike. In northern and central Italy, a large force of Franks, Germanic allies of the Goths, who had invaded opportunistically, is said to have been decimated by the sickness. These warriors, hardy and battle-trusted, succumb within days to a foe they cannot fight. An account relates that as the Frankish host camped near the River Po, plague erupted among them. Like a fire, men who had boasted of their invincibility were laid low, and in fear the survivors fled back across the Alps. Their invasion was halted not by spears or arrows but by pestilence. Rome, the once glorious capital of the world by the 548s, is a shell of its former self, but it still holds tens of thousands of inhabitants and great symbolic importance. The plague reaches Rome perhaps in 543 or 544. The city had already been sacked and besieged repeatedly in the Gothic War, and now nature delivers another blow. While specific Roman accounts of this first outbreak are scant, later generations would recall that the mid-6th century saw Death's Head stalking the streets of Rome as well. One can imagine grass growing in the Forum, and the Colosseum, which had long ceased hosting grand games, now perhaps sheltering the sick who sought a roof over their heads after being turned out of their homes. There are later legends that Pope Pelagius, who became pope in the 550 S, was so moved by the suffering he witnessed during a plague outbreak in Rome, perhaps a later wave around 549, that he devoted himself to caring for the sick and distributing grain to the populace, an act of mercy that earned him respect. From Italy, trade and travel carry the pestilence further. By 543, 544, reports of the plague have reached the Frankish kingdom of Gaul, roughly modern France, and neighbouring regions. In the vibrant Mediterranean ports of Gaul, cities like Marseille and Arles, ships arrive bearing the contagion along with their wares. The plague then pushes north and inland. A Frankish chronicler, St. Gregory of Tours, later writes of a terrible sickness that struck the Auvergne region in central Gaul around this time. People developed swellings in the groin, he notes, and died swiftly. He describes how panic gripped the countryside. So many perished that survivors fled to the mountains, abandoning their villages in hopes that the higher, cleaner air would spare them. High above their deserted hamlets, these country folk huddle in caves or rough shelters, watching the smoke from their village chimneys cease day by day, an eerie sign that those left behind have died or fled as well. In the valleys below, fields go untended, cows wander without herdsmen, harvests rot where they stand, and wolves begin to prowl the edges of silent villages. The wave of plague does not halt at Gaul. It crosses the seas to the British Isles, the farthest reaches of the known world, to the Roman perspective. Britain at this time is divided among various post-Roman kingdoms and migrating peoples. Anglo-Saxons in the east, native Britons, and Celtic peoples in the west and north. Written records from 6th century Britain are scarce, but archaeological evidence and later sources hint at disaster. Scientists in recent years have found DNA of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, in early medieval graves in England, proof that the Justinianic Plague touched that land. A later Welsh chronicle speaks of a yellow plague in the late 6th century that carried off countless souls. Irish annals too mention strange pestilences in the 540s, 550s, notably called bled in one source. The lack of detailed writing means the human stories are lost to time, but we can imagine them. Perhaps a coastal trading village in the south of England sees a ship from Gaul limp into harbour with half its crew dead or dying. The villagers approach the vessel to offer help, only to catch the sickness themselves. Soon that village is ravaged, and rumours spread to other settlements of a curse coming across the sea. Some communities might quarantine themselves, hill forts barricading their gates, monasteries closing to outsiders, but still the plague finds its way through the web of contacts. In remote hamlets of Britain, as in other places, some settlements simply vanish, left abandoned with hearth fires cold and doors swinging open in the wind, to be discovered generations later as ivy-covered ruins and empty huts. For example, in the Frankish realm of Gaul, one chronicler, the Bishop Gregory of Tours, described how the plague hit a certain town so fiercely that many houses were left without a single living inhabitant. The survivors, he wrote, were like guests in their own land. So few remained that the living could hardly bury the dead. Some, as we noted, fled to mountain caves and remote glens, trying to escape what they believed was a poisoned air or a punishment from God. In one village, it was said, wolves came and feasted on unattended corpses because there were not enough people to remove them. A ghastly image that later generations in that region would repeat in hushed tones. In Spain, under the Visigothic kingdom, we hear of similar devastation. One chronicler in Spain wrote that in some areas, a man would go to plough the fields with his oxen and return to find his household dead. Whole towns fell quiet, their church bells tolled constantly for funerals, day after day, until eventually there was no one left to ring them. The living in one town might wake to find that a neighbouring town across the river had gone completely silent overnight. In the countryside, the plague often moved more slowly than in dense cities, but it was no less devastating when it arrived. Isolated farms and hamlets might hold out while the cities suffered, only to be struck when a travelling merchant or wandering refugee brought the illness weeks or months later. One can imagine a small farming family miles from the nearest town, thinking themselves safe as they hear distant rumours of sickness carried on the grapevine. Then one autumn evening, a peddler who visited their farm a few days before falls ill with the telltale signs. Soon the father of the family develops a fever, then the mother and children. With no physicians or priests anywhere nearby, they suffer alone. If none survive, their farm slowly reverts to nature. Crops withering in the fields, chickens and goats wandering off into the woods, and wild grasses creeping over the doorstep. Such tragedies, unrecorded in any chronicle, must have been common in those years. In more populated rural areas, sometimes a few survived enough to bury the others, and eventually returned to the rhythms of agriculture, though with far fewer hands. In some regions, forests expanded as fields went untended, fallow land invited shrubs and saplings to take root. Travellers in later decades would occasionally come upon remnants of a village, a crumbling stone wall or an overgrown orchard, and realised that where now deer grazed peacefully, once families had lived before the pestilence emptied the place. The plague's mark on the landscape was subtle but real. A world less populated meant pockets of wilderness reclaimed what had been human domain. By the mid-540s, the first great wave of the pandemic has largely run its course across the Mediterranean world in Europe. The initial onslaught, which began in 541 and rippled outward for several years, leaves behind a drastically altered human geography. It is estimated, though numbers are hazy, that between 20 and 50 million people may have died across Eurasia and North Africa, perhaps a quarter or more of the population of the areas affected. The Roman Empire, east and what little remained of west, is gravely depopulated. Many cities will never again reach the population they held before the plague. Rural areas, too, have been scarred, especially those near trade routes or coasts, yet pockets remain relatively untouched. Some remote highland villages or islands that managed to stay isolated have weathered the storm with minimal loss. In these fortunate enclaves, life continues almost normally, and in time they may send people to repopulate abandoned areas nearby. But such havens are exceptions. For the vast majority of communities, the mid-6th century is remembered as a time of extraordinary suffering and loss. The immediate aftermath of this first wave sees a world stunned and reshaped. Political and military events that might have played out differently are now set on new paths. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, for instance, although still strong on paper, is severely weakened in reality. Justinian, once intent on further conquests and grand reforms, finds his empire struggling simply to keep what it has. The armies that had been so successful against Goths and Vandals can no longer replenish themselves easily with local recruits. Too many potential soldiers are dead or debilitated. The imperial treasury, which funded wars and great building projects, is much diminished, as countless taxpayers now lie in graves. The ambitious dream of restoring the full Roman Empire fades. Justinian does manage to cling to his conquests for his lifetime, but barely. In the years following the plague, the empire's ability to project power wanes. The pandemic's toll contributes to a weakening that invites new threats. The Lombards, a Germanic tribe from the north, invade Italy in 568, only 26 years after the plague devastated that land. They encounter a population still recovering and defences that are thinly manned. The remaining Byzantine garrisons in northern Italy cannot withstand them. City after city in the north falls to the Lombards with little fight, as local Italians, many of whom have lost family and are weary from decades of war and disease, offer scant resistance. Within a few years, the Lombards established their own kingdom in Italy. The Italian peninsula fragments, Lombard rulers in the north and centre, and the Byzantines holding only pockets like the city of Ravenna and parts of the south. Italy, which Justinian fought so hard to reincorporate, slips away, largely because the empire can no longer muster the strength to hold it. This fragmentation endures. Italy remains divided into small realms, and never again is fully united under Rome or Constantinople, drifting instead toward a medieval patchwork of duchies and city-states. In the Eastern Empire's Asian provinces, a similar story plays out decades later. The Byzantine and Persian empires, exhausted by years of war and weakened by recurring plagues, face a new power rising unexpectedly from the deserts: the Arab armies of Islam. In the 630s and 640s, energized by a fresh faith and led by capable leaders, the Arabs overrun vast territories. The Byzantine Empire, with its depopulated ranks and strained finances, cannot hold Syria, Palestine and Egypt, regions that had been part of the empire for centuries. These provinces fall swiftly to the Arabs. The ancient city of Alexandria, still somewhat recovering from the 541 plague, and then hit by subsequent waves and Persian invasion in 619, surrenders to the Arabs in 641. With it goes Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. Historians debate all the reasons for the stunning success of the early Islamic conquest, but many agree that the Byzantine Empire's demographic and economic enfeeblement, due to the plague and other factors, made it far less capable of resisting a vigorous new foe. The Persians too fall to the Arabs. Their last king is killed in 651, and the Sassanid Empire collapses entirely. The world map is radically redrawn. An Islamic caliphate now controls the Middle East and North Africa, and the Byzantine Empire is reduced to primarily Anatolia, modern Turkey, and parts of the Balkans. One can trace a line from the plague's weakening influence to these epochal shifts. The pandemic set the stage for the end of antiquity's balance of power and the rise of a new order. Within the empire's remaining borders, everyday life has changed in myriad ways. Urban centres struggle to maintain themselves. Many cities that had thrived in the early 6th century shrink considerably by the early 7th. Archaeological layers in cities like Antioch, Corinth, and others show signs of contraction. Splendid buildings not repaired after earthquakes or fires, whole neighbourhoods abandoned, public amenities like bathhouses and theatres, which require a critical mass of people and city funds, frequently fall into disuse. In some towns, the very layout changes. People retreat from exposed outskirts and cluster in easily defensible cores or nearby hills, sometimes throwing up crude walls around smaller perimeters. The urban vibe of the high Roman Empire gives way to a quieter, more half-rural character. For instance, in the ruins of what was once a grand forum, one might find that by the 7th century a community has built a small church or a market garden amid the columns, repurposing space to the simpler needs of the times. One might imagine a provincial city, say in Greece or Asia Minor, that 20 years earlier had a busy marketplace and well-tended public buildings. After the waves of plague, a traveller passing through in the late 6th century would find a change scene. The marketplace is perhaps half empty, with a few stalls under the old colonnades and many others boarded up. The public baths are closed, tiles falling from their roofs because there are neither funds nor patrons to maintain them. A once splendid townhouse, whose entire owning family died off, stands quietly deteriorating. Its courtyard fountain is dry, and ivy creeps along its cracked walls. In the central plaza, grass pushes up between paving stones that had been swept clean every day in better times. If that traveller lingers until dusk, he would see light in far fewer windows than before, and hear the nighttime silence broken only by the distant howl of a stray dog or jackal. The urban vigour of the classical past has ebbed, leaving skeletons of cities that continue in a simpler fashion. And in the countryside around such a town, more land lies untilled. Villages that formerly sent surplus produce to the city now struggle to feed themselves, their populations thinned, and many fields surrendered to wildflowers and thistle. The shape of human settlement itself is visibly altered, contracting in some places, dispersing in others. Rural life, conversely, takes on relatively greater importance. With trade networks frayed and cities diminished, communities rely more on local agriculture. Great aristocratic estates, the latifundia of old, either consolidate further or in some cases crumble if their owners died without heirs. In many regions, surviving landowners accumulate the lands of their deceased neighbours, becoming even larger magnates in their area. These magnates, in the absence of strong centralized administration, often take on roles of local leadership, protecting the locals in exchange for labor or rents. This dynamic paves the way for what will become feudalism in later centuries, where power is decentralized and based on land ownership and personal loyalty. The plague episode contributed to this weakening of centralized authority and the strengthening of local ties. As the disease spread throughout the Mediterranean world, the empire's ability to resist its enemies weakened, and so did its ability to enforce the old Roman-style governance everywhere. The plague also devastates the agricultural sector. Less people means fewer farmers, which means less grain is produced, food becomes scarcer and more expensive. The empire's tax revenues, largely drawn from agriculture and trade, plummet. This economic strain does not immediately dissuade Justinian and his successors from trying to collect what they can. Indeed, in some accounts, Justinian continued to demand high taxes, even from provinces reeling from population loss, which bred resentment. But eventually, reality forces adjustments. Tax assessments are reduced in many districts because there simply aren't enough taxpayers left. In some cases, the government combines or eliminates administrative districts because towns have disappeared or populations have migrated. With the economy in a tailspin, coinage becomes scarcer in daily life, barter becomes more common in outlying areas. Over time, long-distance luxury trade, like silks, spices, decreases, while local markets of necessity goods remain. The plague does not spare the leadership class either. Many local officials, judges, and bureaucrats perish, sometimes crippling the machinery of government in a region. There are reports in later histories that in certain cities the governor, the bishop, and most of the town council died in the same season, leaving a power vacuum and confusion until provincial authorities could send replacements, if those authorities themselves were still functioning. Such breakdowns mean that laws go unenforced and public works are neglected. In some areas, banditry increases after the plague, simply because there are fewer soldiers and guards to patrol the roads, an eerie foreshadowing of the more lawless early medieval period, when security is often maintained by local lords rather than state officials. The death of so many educated and governing individuals also means a loss of knowledge and continuity. The scribes who keep records, the scholars who teach in city academies, the engineers who maintain aqueducts and bridges, all these professions suffer drastic losses. Society has to retrain or replace these roles slowly over subsequent generations. This contributes to a sense of fragmentation and even regression in the immediate post-plague decades, as communities focus on basic survival and rebuilding rather than grand cultural or scientific endeavors. Spiritually, the pandemic deepens the conviction among many that such disasters are manifestations of divine will, punishment for sin, or trials of faith. John of Ephesus, a pious bishop in Syria who lived through the plague's ravages, explicitly preaches that the plague is God's chastisement for mankind's wickedness. In Constantinople and elsewhere, clergy call for repentance. People flock, so long as they are healthy enough, to churches to confess and beg for mercy. Some engage in acts of public penance, dressing in sackcloth, sprinkling ashes on their heads, processing barefoot through the streets when gatherings are outright banned due to contagion. A mood of moral introspection grips society. This isn't universal. Certainly, some individuals respond by casting off moral restraint, thinking apocalypse is at hand anyway, but the general cultural drift is towards religiosity. Churches that were once half empty on normal days now see more constant attendance, at least when plague is not at peak. Charitable giving increases. Those with wealth, reminded of life's fragility, donate land or money to the church or to the poor in hopes of heavenly reward or averting God's wrath. The cumulative effect of plague, strange weather, and war leads many to genuinely wonder if they are living in the end times foretold in Scripture. In churches, passages from the book of Revelation about pestilence and the sounding of the trumpets take on immediate resonance. A number of preachers openly speculate that the last judgment is near. John of Ephesus and other clerics describe the plague in almost apocalyptic terms, calling it a scourge from God and likening the heaps of the dead to the prophecies of final tribulations. For some communities, the plague indeed feels like the world ending. There are accounts of people overcome by despair or fervor, donning sackcloth and living on bread and water in constant prayer, preparing their souls for what they fear is the imminent end of the world. Conversely, others adopt an almost nihilistic attitude, a eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die mindset. Procopius, in his Secret History, notes that some in Constantinople indulged in excessive drinking and revelry amid the plague, reasoning that since death could come any day, they would enjoy the short time left. Both reactions, extreme piety and reckless hedonism, are observed and recorded. These behaviors show how profoundly the psychological impact of the pandemic shakes people's worldview. Over time, when the world does not literally end in the 540s, most people return to a more normal outlook, but the brush with what felt like Armageddon leaves an imprint on the collective consciousness. It reinforces a sense of living in a fallen, precarious world where God's will or mysterious forces can overturn human plans at any moment. This sensibility permeates early medieval culture, an intensification of focus on salvation and the afterlife, sometimes at the expense of concern for worldly progress. Culturally, the plague's era marks a turning point as well. Intellectual life, which had still carried echoes of the classical Roman traditions in Justinian's time, becomes increasingly focused on the spiritual and on immediate practical needs. Some schools in devastated cities close for lack of teachers or students. Many centers of learning shrink or operate within monasteries rather than the old secular academies. The Great Library of Alexandria, for instance, had already been declining and suffers further neglect after the plague and subsequent Persian invasion. The scholarly community around it disperses. Literature shifts in tone and content. Secular scholarship and grand histories in the tradition of Livy or Tacitus grow rarer. Instead, we see a flowering of hagiography and devotional writing. People want to read about saints who performed miracles, about holy men and women who cured the sick or saved cities through prayer. Perhaps this reflects a collective search for hope and meaning amid devastation. In the generations after the plague, numerous lives of saints are written and circulated, often emphasizing divine mercy and the triumph of faith over adversity. The style of writing becomes more straightforward, less adorned with classical rhetoric. It is as if writers and readers, having witnessed inexplicable suffering, hunger for spiritual reassurance rather than philosophical discourse. This doesn't mean creativity dies, far from it, but it channels into forms more fitting to a world that feels more fragile and transient. The magnificent natural philosophy and ornate rhetoric of the classical age dim, while simpler, heartfelt stories of local saints and martyrs gain popularity. These cultural shifts are subtle and will deepen over time, but the Plague years form one of the watersheds where the classical world's influence visibly recedes in favor of what we recognize as medieval culture, suffused with religiosity and a focus on survival and salvation. Throughout the later 6th and 7th centuries, the plague returns periodically in what are essentially aftershocks of the first great wave. Roughly every decade or two, though sometimes in quick succession, sometimes with longer gaps, a new outbreak flares up in some region. These aren't as universally catastrophic as the initial eruption, but in certain locales, they can be nearly as severe. For example, Constantinople experiences notable recurrences, one around 558, another around 573, and yet another severe one in 586. Each time, the city suffers thousands of deaths, again, though none rivals the sheer horror of 542. Likewise, the plague revisits Italy, Gaul, and the Middle East multiple times. In 571, it strikes Rome during the pontificate of Pope John III. In 590, it famously strikes Rome again during the very beginning of Pope Gregory the Great's tenure. This is the outbreak during which Gregory led a penitential procession and, according to tradition, had the vision of the Archangel Michael atop Hadrian's mausoleum, signaling an end to the pestilence. In 589-590, the plague also rages in Gaul and kills members of the Frankish royal family. Each generation or so, a new wave reminds people that the scourge is not gone. As these recurrences become a part of life, societies adapt their behavior. Communities quietly absorb lessons about disease, even if they don't understand the science. Many realize that when sickness breaks out, it often helps to stay away from the sick. And thus, by the later 6th and 7th centuries, it's observed that towns sometimes close their gates to travelers if rumor of plague is nearby. There's an instance recorded in 590 of the city of Syracuse in Sicily refusing entry to a ship from Gaul because plague was known to be in Marseilles, a primitive form of quarantine. People also learned to isolate the ill within their households if possible, or to send them to outlying areas. The idea that disease could be contagious has entered common law, even if they explain it as bad air or divine punishment rather than germs. When smaller illness outbreaks occur, towns respond more quickly by cleaning streets, burning refuse, and suspending large gatherings, rudimentary public health measures. In Constantinople, after enduring multiple bouts of plague, the city authorities start improving waste disposal and burial practices. They establish a system, some sources suggest by the 7th century, of nightly collection of the dead during outbreaks to quickly remove corpses from houses and streets, an early attempt at sanitation to combat disease spread. Access to clean water is also emphasized. New systems and wells are built under later emperors, partly to ensure water doesn't become contaminated during crises. Such measures are not always effective, but they represent small steps toward a public health consciousness. In a sense, the Justinian Plague, in its harsh way, teaches society about the importance of quarantine and hygiene long before those concepts have scientific backing. By around 750 CE, nearly 2 centuries after it began, the first plague pandemic finally fades out. The reasons for its disappearance are not entirely clear, but theories abound. It's possible that the pathogen's host reservoirs shifted. Perhaps climate change affected the rodent populations, or a natural evolutionary attenuation of the bacterium occurred, making it less lethal or less transmissible. It's also possible that the disease lingered in an endemic fashion, but with such low-level impact that chroniclers ceased to take note. In any case, after about 750, we hear no more of widespread plague outbreaks in Europe or the Near East until the Black Death of the 14th century. The people of the 8th and 9th centuries, at least in Europe, likely had only dim memories of the pandemic of Justinian's time. It became something mentioned in old histories, a calamity of the distant past. Life in those later medieval centuries had its own challenges, but a pandemic of that magnitude was not among them until many generations later. Now, the world that has emerged by the year 750 looks quite different from the one of 541. The Byzantine Empire has survived but transformed. It is smaller, more defensive, its society more agrarian, and its cities fewer and smaller. Western Europe is firmly in what we call the early Middle Ages, a patchwork of kingdoms, Frankish, Visigothic, Anglo-Saxon, Lombard, etc. A far cry from the united Roman Empire of old. Populations everywhere are much lower than they were in the early 6th century. It will take centuries for numbers to climb back, in some areas not until the high Middle Ages around the 12th century. The economy is simplified, local self-sufficiency is more common, long-distance trade of luxury goods is limited. The Christian church stands as the most universal and unifying institution. Its monasteries and bishops often the main source of continuity and knowledge. And the ethos is unmistakably medieval, concerned with salvation, resilient in hardship, and localized in focus. In the calm after the storm, it's poignant to consider how much was forever changed by the pandemic. In hindsight, one can outline the many ways this plague shaped the course of history. It accelerated the end of the ancient world, of sprawling cities and far-reaching imperial ambition, hastening the onset of a more fragmented medieval world of smaller communities and regional powers. It elevated the role of faith. The Christian church grew even more central as a source of comfort and authority when secular governments failed to provide relief. It thinned populations, and in doing so turned some fertile fields back to wilderness and some bustling towns into quiet villages, literally changing the human geography of Europe and the Near East. It quietly began to reshape social arrangements. With fewer people, the strict hierarchies of the old Roman world bent, and new opportunities and challenges emerged for those who remained. Land was more plentiful relative to labor, so workers could sometimes demand better terms, sowing the seeds of a different social order. In short, this pandemic drew a line between one era and the next. It was one of those great trials that marked the turning of ages. After it, the world was still Roman in memory and institution, but increasingly medieval in its rhythms and structures. Some historians even define the end of classical antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages by this very event, seeing the Justinianic Plague as the decisive threshold between the two. Even though the pandemic of Justinian's time eventually faded into obscurity, its legacy lived on in these transformations. The world of Charlemagne in the 9th century or of the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th, each bore in its social fabric the subtle imprints of the Great Plague, whether people realized it or not. The story of the Justinianic Plague is not just one of devastation, but also of endurance and adaptation. As the night deepens on our journey through this haunted yet enlightening past, let us envision a quiet evening in Constantinople, some years after the worst has passed, say around 560. The lamps are lit and flicker in the breeze along the colonnaded streets. The great dome of Hagia Sophia looms in silhouette against a starry sky. Along the main thoroughfare, the Mies, a few late passers-by, hurry home, their footfalls echoing softly. The city is a little emptier, a little more subdued than it was in Justinian's youth, but it lives on. From an open window drifts the soft sound of a lullaby. It is Andreas, gently rocking his infant son to sleep. The baby was born soon after the plague took Helena, and though his mother is gone, Andreas is thankful beyond words that this little life has endured. He sings a familiar tune, softly under his breath, grateful that they survive, and determined to cherish every moment. His little daughter, now 5 years old, sits at his feet, clutching a rag doll, soothed by her father's gentle song. In that tender moment, Andreas imagines that Helena's loving spirit is watching over them, and despite all his losses, he feels a quiet peace. In a modest tavern down the street, a handful of labourers gather and raise a cup in memory of absent friends, then talk quietly about tomorrow's work, repairing a collapsed wall here, tilling a field outside the city there, determined to continue with life. The empire still stands, bruised, smaller, but standing. In their own humble ways, these survivors are carrying forward the lamp of civilization into a new era, even if they do not think of it in such grand terms. In the wider world, too, dawn eventually follows the darkness. The plagues rampage lessons generation by generation. Societies adapt. The people of the medieval world that emerges, whether Byzantine Greeks, Frankish Gauls, or Arab Muslims, build anew with what remains. They till the soil, raise families, pray for better times, and gradually, quietly, lay the foundations of the next chapters of history. Now, as the long arc of our story bends toward its close, we can reflect on the resilience that resides in humanity. The Justinianic Plague was one of history's great calamities, a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. It shook the foundations of the known world. Yet from that shaken world, a new one arose. It was different, yes, more modest in some ways, more devout, more localized, but not empty and not hopeless. Human life continued, communities endured, and the threads of memory and learning, though thinned, were never completely snapped. It is time to leave behind this distant era, with its gilded mosaics and its mass graves, its towering ambitions and its humbled survivors. As we step away from that epoch, let us carry the lessons and echoes it offers us. The pandemic we've explored shaped the medieval world in profound ways. It brought an end to an age of empire and ushered in an age of faith and localism. It tested humans to their core and taught them, in response, compassion, adaptability, and a sharpened sense of life's fragility. Now, in the quiet of this moment, we let these reflections settle in our minds like dust falling gently after a great storm. The people of those distant times went on to find moments of peace, to plant seeds for the future, to sing lullabies to their children, just as we heard Andreas do. In our own lives too, troubles pass, and the human story goes on, ever unfolding. Thank you for accompanying us on this quiet journey through forgotten history, through the twilight of antiquity and the dawn of the Middle Ages. May the courage and endurance of those who came before lull you into a peaceful rest and remind you that even after the darkest of nights, the dawn quietly, inevitably arrives. Good night and sleep well as the echoes of history gently whisper us into dreams.